The wind that scoured the Wyoming plains had a voice, and it spoke of nothing but endings. It was a language Eli Reeves understood better than most. It whispered through the broken slats of the fences his father had raised, moaned under the sagging roof of the cabin his mother had made a home, and hissed across the barren ground that held them all now. He had been gone 10 years, a lifetime measured in miles, drifted and sorrows collected. And returning to Dry Willow felt less like a homecoming and more like a pilgrimage to a grave. His brother, Thomas, had been the first to go, swallowed by a war that promised glory and delivered only a folded flag and a letter full of empty words. His mother followed not long after, her grief a quiet sickness that hollowed her out until she was as thin and brittle as a winter leaf. His father, stubborn as the granite hills, had clung to the homestead, fighting the land, the creditors, and his own breaking heart until the day he was found slumped over the very fence line he'd been trying to mend. His body surrendered to the same unforgiving earth he'd tried to tame. Eli, the one who was left, had run. He'd worked ranches from the dusty flats of Texas to the high mountains of Montana, chasing a silence he could never quite catch. The ghosts of his family rode with him, their face etched into the landscapes of his memory. Now, at 28, the running was done. The land, neglected and wild, was his inheritance. It was all that was left of his name, and he had come back to claim it, to see if a man could rebuild a life from the wreckage of another. The homestead was a skeleton picked clean by time and weather, the porch tilted at a drunken angle, its boards rotted through. The windows were dark, vacant eyes, a few panes shattered, letting the relentless wind cry through the empty rooms. Inside, dust lay thick as a shroud over the few pieces of furniture that remained. A mouse skittered across the floor, its tiny claws a lonely sound in the profound silence. For 3 days, Eli did nothing but walk the perimeter, his boots crunching on the brittle grass, his hands shoved deep in his pockets against a cold that went bone deep. He was taking the measure of the ruin, both outside and in. Then, on the 4th morning, he began. The work was a brutal balm, a physical pain that could, for a few hours at a time, shout down the ache in his soul. He started with the fence, digging new post holes in the iron-hard ground, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The rhythmic shock of the post driver jarring up his arms was a kind of prayer, a punishment, a reason to keep breathing. He tore the rotted shingles from the roof, his knuckles raw and bleeding, and began the slow, arduous task of replacing them. He worked from before the sun rose until long after it had bled out behind the western peaks, fueled by stale bread, dried meat, and a grim determination that passed for hope. He was a solitary figure against a vast, indifferent sky, a man at war with decay, fighting for every inch of ground. The land had taken everything from him. Now he would take something back. It was during one of those pale, frozen dawns that he first saw her. He was standing on the partially repaired roof, the hammer hanging loose in his hand, watching the world emerge from its gray slumber, down by the river, where the water ran dark and sluggish between shelves of ice. A figure moved. It was a woman, wrapped in a thick, ragged wool shawl that hid her shape and shadowed her face. She carried 2 buckets, and she moved with a slow, deliberate pace, as if every step was a calculation against the slick ice and the biting cold. She knelt at the river's edge, broke a thin layer of ice with a stone, and dipped her buckets. Even from this distance, Eli could sense the weariness in her posture, the deep, settled exhaustion of someone who had been cold for a very long time. She did not look up. She simply filled her buckets, straightened with a visible effort, and began the slow walk back toward a small, dilapidated cabin tucked into the scrub oaks at the far edge of his property line. She was just a silhouette, a nameless, faceless piece of the harsh landscape, and yet he watched until she disappeared inside her small dwelling, a thin curl of smoke soon rising from her chimney to be torn apart by the wind. A week later, his supplies running low, Eli rode his horse, Bess, into Dry Willow. The town hadn't changed much. It was a single dusty street lined with stout wooden buildings, their signs faded by the sun and scoured by the wind. The general store, the saloon, the church, and the sheriff's office stood like tired sentinels, watching the slow passage of time. As he tethered Bess to the hitching post outside Gable's Mercantile, he felt the familiar weight of eyes on him. Some of the older folks recognized him, their expressions a mixture of surprise and pity. He was Jedediah Reeves's boy, the one who'd left. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and sawdust. Silas Gable, a man whose frame had thickened and whose hair had thinned since Eli last saw him, stood behind the counter. "Eli Reeves," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "Heard you were back. Come to take on your father's ghost, have you?" "Something like that," Eli answered, his voice rough from disuse. He handed Silas his list. "Just need some basics. Flour, salt, coffee, some nails." As Silas gathered the items, his movements were slow and deliberate. He paused, his hand hovering over a sack of beans. "You're living out at the old place, then, all alone out there?" It was not a question. "I am." Silas looked him straight in the eye, his gaze steady and heavy with meaning. "Your property line runs up near the Morell place. Woman named Lena Morell lives there." Eli thought of the figure at the river. "I've seen her." The shopkeeper's face hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening. He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hush, though there was no one else in the store to hear. "She ain't right, son. The woman's got a darkness clinging to her. Best you keep your distance. Stay away from her. Nothing but trouble follows in her wake." Eli met his gaze without flinching. He had seen enough real trouble in the world to be wary of the kind that was manufactured in the mouths of gossips. He said nothing, simply took his sacks, paid his coin, and left. The warning, however, hung in the air, as thick and cloying as the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. The following Sunday, driven by a ghost of his mother's piety, Eli went to church. He felt out of place in the clean, quiet space, his hands rough and calloused against the smooth wood of the pew. He sat near the back, an observer more than a participant, the Reverend's words a distant drone, and then he saw her again. Lena Morell slipped in just as the first hymn began, a shadow detaching itself from the doorway. She moved to the very last pew on the opposite side, keeping her head down, her face obscured by the brim of a plain, worn bonnet. She sat utterly alone. A space of several feet, a veritable moat of empty wood, separated her from the next family, when a small child, escaping his mother's grasp, toddled toward her pew. The mother snatched him back with a sharp, panicked gesture, her face a mask of fear and disapproval. Throughout the service, no one spoke to Lena. No one even looked in her direction, except for the furtive, sideways glances of condemnation. Eli watched her hands, which rested in her lap. They were not the soft, pale hands of a townswoman. They were red and raw, the knuckles bruised and swollen as if from hard labor or a recent injury. She never sang. She simply sat, a stone of silence in a river of murmured prayers. When the service ended, she was the first to leave, slipping out as quietly as she had entered, before the tide of fellowship could begin to flow and pointedly wash around her. As Eli stood on the church steps, blinking in the harsh sunlight, he heard the whispers. They were low and venomous, passed from one respectable churchgoer to another. From a town in Nebraska, they say, "Left in the middle of the night. Husband, wasn't it? Found him dead in his own bed, cold as a stone." Her hands on him. They whispered. The law came asking, but she was already gone. Like smoke. Practices dark things out in that shack. A cousin of Martha's swore he saw strange lights there one night. The stories were a tangled mess of fear and speculation, each teller adding a new, more sinister thread. Runaway bride, murderess, witch. The women clutched their children closer. The men shook their heads, their faces grim and certain. Lena Morrell was a blight on their town, a judgment they had all agreed upon without the need for a trial. Eli listened, his face impassive. The words meant little to him. He'd learned long ago that the stories people told about others were almost always stories about themselves, their fears, their failings, their need for a devil to blame for the shadows in their own hearts. A few days later, he was riding back from town, a new axe head resting in his saddlebag, when he saw a commotion near the small schoolhouse. A freight wagon, its team of 4 heavy draft horses spooked by a snake in the road, had bolted. The driver was sawing at the reins, his face white with panic, his curses lost in the thunder of hooves and the rattle of the heavy wagon. Children, just released from their lessons, scattered like quail, their joyful shrieks turning to screams of terror. One small boy, no older than 6, stood frozen in the middle of the road. A book dropped at his feet, his face a perfect circle of fear. The horses were bearing down on him, their eyes wide and white. People shouted from the porches, but no one moved. It was all happening too fast. And then, she was there. Lena Morrell had been walking along the side of the road, a small basket in her hand. Eli saw her move in a blur of gray wool. There was no hesitation. She did not scream or cry out. She dropped her basket and launched herself into the path of the oncoming team. She grabbed the boy by the collar of his shirt, literally flinging him out of the way. He landed with a cry in the soft dust of the roadside, unharmed. She, however, was not so lucky. She didn't have time to get clear. The lead horse, in its panic, struck her a glancing blow with its shoulder, sending her spinning to the ground. She landed hard, her body curling into a tight ball as the massive wagon wheels churned past, missing her by inches. The wagon driver finally got the team under control some 50 yards down the road. A woman, the boy's mother, rushed out and gathered her child in her arms, sobbing with relief. Others began to emerge, their faces pale. Eli had already dismounted and was running toward her. He reached her as she was pushing herself up. One hand pressed to her side, her bonnet had been knocked off, and, for the first time, he saw her face clearly. It was not the face of a monster or a witch. It was a young face, far younger than he'd imagined, framed by a cascade of dark, untidy hair. It was a face made of sharp angles and pale skin, but it was her eyes that held him. They were a deep, hollowed-out gray, and in them, he saw a grief so profound it looked like a permanent part of her, as familiar and constant as the color of the sky. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low. She flinched at the sound of his voice, scrambling to her feet and backing away from his offered hand. She snatched her bonnet from the dust and quickly put it on, hiding her face once more. She gave him a short, jerky nod, then turned and began walking away, limping slightly, without a single word. The boy's mother, still clutching her son, stared after her, her expression a strange mix of gratitude and suspicion. No one called out a word of thanks. No one went to see if she was all right. They just watched her go, this woman who had just saved a child's life, as if she were a stray dog that had performed an unexpected trick. Eli stood in the middle of the road, the dust settling around him, and felt a cold, hard knot of anger form in his gut. That night, the wind howled around his cabin, a lonely, mournful sound. He sat by the fire, but the warmth did not reach him. He kept seeing her face, the stark terror and raw courage that had flashed across it in that single, violent moment. He thought of the town's whispers, of the empty space around her in the church, of the way she had recoiled from the simple offer of a hand. He got up. He went to the small root cellar he had just finished digging and filled a burlap sack with the last of his father's potatoes. They were small and withered, but they were food. He pulled on his coat, stepped out into the biting wind, and walked toward her cabin. A faint light glowed in her window. As he approached, he saw the place was even smaller and more run down than his own. The chinking between the logs was crumbling, and a piece of oiled canvas served as a pane for one of the windows. He knocked on the rough-hewn door. Silence. The only sound was the wind and the creak of a loose shutter. He knocked again, louder this time. "Ma'am," he called out. "It's Eli Reeves, your neighbor." He heard a faint shuffle from within, and then the door opened a crack in the sliver of space. He could see one of her gray eyes, wide and wary, like a cornered animal's. He held up the sack. "These are from my father's last harvest. I have more than I need. I thought you might have a use for them." She stared at the sack, then at his face, her expression unreadable in the darkness. He expected her to refuse, to slam the door. He half expected her to tell him to go to hell, but she did neither. After a long, tense moment, the door opened a little wider. A slender, bruised hand emerged and took the sack from him. It was surprisingly heavy, and she had to use both hands to hold it. She did not speak. She did not say thank you. She simply looked at him for a second longer, a flicker of something unidentifiable in those haunted eyes, and then she gave a single, small nod. The door closed, and he was left alone in the dark. As he walked back to his cabin, the cold didn't seem to bite so deep. His interest in her was not pity. He had no use for pity. It was a useless emotion, a cheap coin offered to the suffering. What he felt was something else entirely, something quieter and more profound. It was recognition. When he had looked into Lena Morell's eyes, he had seen the same landscape that existed behind his own. It was a place of loss, of silence, of survival. He did not know her story, and she did not know his. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that they were citizens of the same desolate country. In the days that followed, he began to notice things. He was a man accustomed to solitude, and it had sharpened his eye for detail. He started seeing the small, unspoken signs of her hardship, the quiet evidence of her struggle. He saw that the boots she wore, the only pair she seemed to own, were held together on one side with a twist of rusted baling wire. He noticed that the wood pile beside her cabin, though stacked, was uneven and haphazard. The larger logs left near the bottom, a sign of an arm too weak or too pained to lift them higher. One afternoon, as she was returning from the river, the wind caught her shawl and blew it back from her face for a moment. He was mending a fence post not 50 yards away, and in the clear, sharp light, he saw a discoloration on her cheekbone, a faded yellowish-purple bruise that was clearly older than her fall by the schoolhouse. It was the kind of mark he'd seen on men who'd gotten the worst of a saloon brawl, but it looked deeply out of place on her pale, delicate skin. She saw him looking, and her hand flew up to pull the shawl tight around her face, her shoulders hunching as if to ward off a blow. She hurried into her cabin, and the door shut firmly behind her. Eli turned back to his fence post, driving a nail in with a single, savage blow of the hammer. The sound of it echoed across the cold, empty land. The fragile truce Eli had with Dry Willow shattered the day he went to Gable's Mercantile for a new spade bit. The air was sharp with the promise of a hard winter, and the store was crowded with ranchers laying in supplies. He was standing by the counter when the door creaked open and Lena Morell slipped inside. A hush fell over the room. Conversations died in mid-sentence. She seemed to shrink under the weight of their collective stare, pulling her ragged shawl tighter as she moved toward the back of the store, keeping her eyes fixed on the floorboards. She was looking for thread, her hands sorting through the spools with a quiet desperation, when two young ranch hands, reeking of cheap whiskey and self-importance, cornered her. They were brothers, the Miller boys, known more for the volume of their boasts than the quality of their work. "Well now, look what the wind blew in." The older one, Jeb, sneered, blocking her path. "If it ain't the Black Widow of Dry Willow?" His younger brother, Caleb, snickered. "Heard you get lonely out in that shack of yours. Lena, a man could get lost on his way out there. Might need you to keep him warm." Lena said nothing. She stood perfectly still, her head bowed, her knuckles white where she clutched a small spool of black thread. Jeb reached out a grimy hand and touched a stray lock of her hair. "Pretty thing like you shouldn't be all alone. It ain't natural." That was when Eli moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply placed himself between them and her, his presence as solid and unyielding as a granite boulder. He was not a large man, but the years of hard labor and harder living had stripped him of every ounce of softness, leaving only corded muscle and a quiet intensity that was more intimidating than any loud threat. "She's not interested," Eli said, his voice a low, flat rumble that cut through the silence of the store. Jeb Miller puffed out his chest. "This ain't none of your concern. Reeves." Eli's eyes, the color of a winter sky, met Jeb's. They were empty of fear, empty of anger, empty of everything but a cold, hard finality. "I'm making it my concern. Now back away from the lady." For a moment, the air was thick with the possibility of violence. Then Caleb, the younger brother, seemed to notice the way Eli's hand was resting near the heavy hammer looped on his belt. He nudged his brother. "Come on, Jeb. She ain't worth it." Jeb spat a wad of tobacco juice that landed dangerously close to Eli's boot. "You're welcome to her. Reeves, damaged goods, the both of you." They swaggered out of the store, laughing loudly to cover their retreat. The other customers immediately resumed their business, the collective hum of conversation returning. But it was a strained, artificial sound. Eli turned. Lena was gone. The only sign she had been there was a single spool of black thread, dropped on the floor. He picked it up, placed a coin on the counter for Silas Gable, who was watching him with undisguised disapproval, and walked out. He left the thread on the railing of her porch on his way home. He didn't see her, but he knew she was watching. The town had a new story to whisper now, one that tied his name firmly to hers. 2 days later, Reverend Wallace rode out to the homestead. He was a good man, earnest in his faith, but he saw the world in the stark, simple terms of his sermons: good and evil, salvation and damnation. He found Eli splitting logs, the axe rising and falling in a steady, punishing rhythm. "Elijah," the Reverend began, his voice soft and full of practiced concern, "I came to see how you were faring. It's a hard thing, to rebuild a life from ashes." "It's work," Eli said, not pausing in his task. The axe bit deep into a round of pine. "The body's work is one thing, the soul's is another. I heard what happened at the Mercantile." Reverend Wallace clasped his hands, his brow furrowed. "You seem like a man of faith, son, a man who understands the trials the Lord sets before us. That woman, she is one such trial. She is a test of your character, not a reward for it. Her path is one of shadow and sorrow. Do not let her lead you down it." Eli stopped his work, leaning the axe against the chopping block. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. "Reverend, with all due respect, I don't see a test. I see a woman who is being harassed by 2 drunks, and no one else in that store, God-fearing or not, saw fit to say a word. Her reputation precedes her," the Reverend insisted gently. "She brings trouble with her. The town is uneasy. By defending her, you take her trouble onto yourself. They will see you as one of her kind." "Then let them," Eli said, and the finality in his tone left no room for further argument. He picked up his axe, and the conversation was over. Winter began to tighten its grip on the land. The winds grew teeth, and the first flakes of snow ghosted through the air. From his cabin, Eli could see the smoke rising from Lena's chimney. It was a thin, hesitant plume, often choked and sputtering. He'd seen chimneys like that before, loose mortar, a cracked flue. It was a wonder it hadn't set the whole cabin ablaze. One morning, the air so cold it felt like breathing shards of glass, he gathered his tools, a bucket of mortar mix, and walked over. He found her outside, gathering fallen branches, her movements stiff with cold. She froze when she saw him approaching, her body tensing for a fight or for flight. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Your chimney's drawing poorly," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "The mortar is crumbling. A strong wind could bring the whole thing down. I can fix it for you." She stared at him, her face pale and pinched. Her gray eyes narrowed with suspicion. For the first time, she spoke to him, her voice a low, raspy whisper. as if the words themselves were painful. "Why do you care?" Eli looked past her, at the vast, empty prairie stretching out to a merciless horizon. He thought of the long years alone, of nights spent shivering in line shacks and leaky bunkhouses, the silence so loud it screamed. "Maybe I don't," he said, his gaze returning to hers. "Maybe I just know what it means to freeze alone." Something in her expression shifted, a barely perceptible softening of her defenses. She gave another one of her small, jerky nods and stepped aside, letting him pass. As she watched him from her window, a ghost of another man, another life, rose to haunt her. His name was Arthur. He had a face that was soft in photographs and hard in person. She had been a mail-order bride, an orphan from a crowded Chicago tenement who had foolishly believed the promises in his letters of a good home, a new life, a gentle hand. The reality was a shack in the Nebraska sandhills, a life of servitude, and a hand that was never, ever gentle. Arthur was a man of small cruelties and large appetites. He treated her like a piece of property he'd purchased, another animal to be worked and used. Her days were a blur of back-breaking labor, and her nights were an agony of endured violation. She learned to live inside herself, to retreat to a small, silent room in her mind where he could not reach her. One night, his temper, fueled by whiskey, had flared into a terrifying rage over a burnt piece of bacon. He had beaten her worse than ever before, his fists like hammers against her body, leaving her bruised and bleeding on the floor. Later, he had come to their bed, his breath sour, and taken what he believed was his right. She had simply endured, as always. But then, in the suffocating darkness, his breathing had become ragged, a horrible, wet, choking sound. He clawed at his own throat, his body convulsing. She had watched, frozen, as the life drained out of him. When it was over, she had gotten up and looked at her hands in the moonlight. They were smeared with his blood. From where she had tried to push him off her earlier, panic, cold and absolute, had seized her. They would call it murder. They would never believe her. They would hang her. She took nothing but the clothes on her back and fled into the night, running until her lungs burned and her feet were raw, leaving the dead man in his bed and a life she had never wanted behind her. A week after Eli fixed her chimney, a blizzard descended. It came without warning, a solid wall of white that erased the world. The wind shrieked like a banshee, piling snow into monstrous drifts. Eli was securing his barn when a shape materialized out of the swirling chaos. It was Lena, half frozen, her shawl caked with ice. But she was not alone. Cradled in her arms was a small, scruffy dog, its leg bent at an unnatural angle, a dark patch of blood staining its matted fur. "He was caught in a trap," she said, her teeth chattering, the words torn away by the wind. "He'll die out here." Eli ushered them into the relative warmth of the barn. He lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the storm's gloom. He made a bed of clean straw for the dog and then gently examined its leg. It was a clean break. While Lena watched, her eyes wide and dark in the flickering light, he fashioned a crude splint from a piece of kindling and strips of a clean rag. The dog whimpered but licked his hand when he was done. The storm raged for 2 days, trapping them in the barn. Eli brought them blankets and a pot of hot coffee from the cabin. They barely spoke. They simply existed together in the howling bubble of the storm, sharing the silence, the warmth of the lantern, and the quiet breathing of the sleeping dog. On the second night, as she sat huddled in a blanket, he noticed the snow in her hair had begun to melt, dripping onto her face. Without thinking, he reached out and gently brushed the cold droplets from her temple with the side of his thumb. It was a simple, human gesture, but she reacted as if he had struck her. She flinched violently, a gasp escaping her lips, and scrambled back, her eyes filling with a sudden, shocking rush of tears. He saw a universe of pain in that single moment, the terror of an unwanted touch, the shock of a gentle one. She turned her face away, but not before he saw the single tear that escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't make a sound, but the air between them thrummed with her silent, ragged weeping. He retreated, his own heart aching with a sorrow he couldn't name, and they spent the rest of the night on opposite sides of the barn, the distance between them a vast and desolate landscape. When the storm finally broke, the world was buried in a pristine, blinding white. The town was digging itself out when Sheriff Brody rode up to Eli's homestead. He was a practical, weary man who preferred order to justice. "Reeves," he said, getting straight to the point. "Heard you had the Morrell woman holed up out here during the storm. Her dog was injured. She brought it to my barn. The storm did the rest," Eli replied evenly. The sheriff sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "Look, son, I'm not here to meddle in your affairs, but word has come from the law in Clay County, Nebraska. They're asking questions about a woman fitting her description, a woman who fled after her husband was found dead under questionable circumstances. Now, right now, it's just questions, but she's trouble. Eli, the kind that attracts marshals and judges. Don't let her kind drag you down. A man is judged by the company he keeps." The warning was clear. Eli simply nodded. "I'll keep that in mind. Sheriff," the town's resentment, already simmering, began to boil over. Children, cruel in their innocence, took up their parents' prejudice. They started creeping to the edge of Lena's property, calling her names, their high-pitched voices chanting, "Witch, witch, ran away in a ditch." One afternoon, their taunts escalated to throwing stones that clattered against the wall of her small cabin. Eli heard the noise from his field. A cold fury, slow and deep, rose in him. He walked toward the sound and found 4 boys, including the son of a prominent rancher, Michael Peterson, in the act of hurling rocks at her door. He didn't shout. He moved with a swift, predatory silence that terrified them more than any noise. He grabbed young Billy Peterson by the scruff of his neck, his grip like iron. The other boys scattered, without a word. Eli marched the whimpering boy back to town and deposited him on the porch of his father's house. Michael Peterson came to the door, his face flushing with anger. "What is the meaning of this? Reeves?" "Your boy was throwing stones at Mrs. Morrell's house," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You teach him better than that." Peterson puffed up with indignation. "You have no right to lay a hand on my son, especially not in defense of that creature." The confrontation only served to pour oil on the fire. Eli was now officially an outcast, a man who would defend the town pariah and manhandle their children. The wall of their scorn grew higher and thicker. Eli ignored them. He saw that Lena's roof was as bad as her chimney, with curled, missing shingles that would never keep out the melting snow. The next morning, he carried a load of new shingles over and set his ladder against her cabin. He didn't ask permission. He just started working. For nearly a week, he spent his days on her roof, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his hammer a steady presence in the quiet air. Lena never came out. He knew she was inside, watching. He felt her gaze on his back. Then, on the 3rd day, he came down from the roof to find a tin cup of steaming water sitting on the wood pile. The day after that, it was a hot biscuit, wrapped in a clean cloth. On the last day, there was a perfectly ripe apple sitting next to his water skin. They never spoke a word. It was a conversation held in shingles and biscuits, in hammers and apples, a silent, fragile bridge being built across an abyss of loneliness and mistrust. One night, long after the moon had risen to cast a stark, silver light on the snow-covered land, a feeling of unease pulled Eli from his cabin. He walked the fence line, his boots crunching in the crystalline silence. As he neared the river, he saw her. She was standing at the edge of the creek, where the current had kept a small channel of black water from freezing over. She was staring down into it, her posture unnaturally still, and she was barefoot. Her bare feet were stark white against the snow, and he knew they had to be numb with a pain that would feel like fire. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Lena?" She didn't seem to hear him at first. She looked up, and in the moonlight, her face was a mask of utter desolation. Her eyes were empty, fixed on something far beyond the frozen landscape. "I just wanted to feel cold," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost part of the wind, "before it swallowed me." The bottom dropped out of Eli's world. He understood in that instant the depth of her despair, the crushing weight of a loneliness so complete it was a breath away from death. He didn't think, he acted. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, bent down, and swept her up into his arms. She was shockingly light, a bundle of bones and cold skin wrapped in thin wool. She didn't struggle. She simply let out a small, broken sigh and sagged against his chest. He carried her back to her cabin. The fire had burned down to embers. He set her down gently in the single rickety chair, then knelt and built the fire back to a roaring blaze. He took the rough blanket from her bed and wrapped it around her feet, chafing them gently until the life began to creep back into them. He pulled up a small wooden stool and sat opposite her, and they stayed that way for a long time, bathed in the warm, flickering light of the fire. The silence in the tiny cabin was absolute, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with her pain and his anger, with her despair and his quiet, stubborn refusal to let it win. It was a silence so profound, so charged with unspoken history and fragile, burgeoning trust, that it was nearly unbearable. The ground gave way with a sickening groan, a sound of deep and final collapse. Eli was hauling a bucket from the old stone well his father had dug when the timbers splintered and the earth swallowed itself, leaving a muddy, impassable crater where his water source had been. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the ruin, another piece of the past devoured by the present. It was a setback he could ill afford, a back-breaking problem that would take weeks to solve alone. He had not even turned back toward his cabin when he saw her. Lena was standing at the edge of her own property, watching him. She held a shovel in her hand. She did not speak, and neither did he. Words were not necessary for this. He retrieved his own shovel and a pickaxe, and when he returned to the crater, she was there, her worn skirts hitched up slightly, her jaw set with a grim resolve. And so they began to dig. They worked in a rhythm born of shared necessity, the swing of his pickaxe breaking the hard, semi-frozen ground, the scrape of her shovel clearing the loose earth. It was brutal, monotonous labor. The sun rose higher, casting their long shadows across the wounded land. Sweat slicked his back despite the cold, and he could see the strain in her thin shoulders, the way she favored her weaker arm. But she did not stop. She matched him swing for swing, her silence a testament to a strength that ran deeper than muscle. In those long, quiet hours, a new language formed between them, a shared glance when a large rock was uncovered, a mutual nod when it was time to rest, the simple act of him passing her the water skin. An unspoken trust began to sprout in the upturned earth, a fragile green thing in a world of brown and gray. They were no longer just 2 lonely people living on adjacent plots of land. They were partners in a common struggle, their solitude overlapping until it was something shared. When the new well was dug, deeper and more secure than the last, they moved on. Together, they cleared a small patch of his land, the field where his father had once grown wheat. They worked side by side, pulling stubborn sagebrush and turning the soil. He showed her how to broadcast the seeds for winter barley, his hand guiding hers for a moment as she learned to cast the grain in a wide, even arc. Then they stood, watching as the wind carried the seeds across the dark, waiting earth, a silent prayer for a future harvest. The partnership, however, was still a delicate thing, easily broken. They were mending a stretch of fence that bordered her property, the old wire rusted and brittle. Eli was stretching a new strand taut while Lena secured it to a post. As she pulled the wire, it snapped back, the barbed end slicing a deep, clean gash across the palm of her hand. She let out a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain, dropping the wire and cradling her hand to her chest. Blood, shockingly red, welled up and began to drip onto the frozen ground. "Let me see," Eli said, his voice low and urgent. "It is nothing," she insisted, turning away from him. her body coiled like a threatened snake. He ignored her protest. He took her arm gently but firmly, and for a second, he felt her entire body go rigid, a tremor of pure animal fear running through her. But she did not pull away. He led her back to his cabin, sat her down at the small table, and fetched a bowl of clean water and a strip of linen from his supply chest. When he reached for her hand, she flinched so violently she nearly knocked the bowl from the table. Her eyes were wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the physical pain of the cut. "I won't hurt you, Lena," he said, his voice softer than he had ever heard it. He did not try to take her hand again. Instead, he simply placed his own on the table, palm up, and waited. He saw the war in her eyes, the instinct to flee, to hide, to never let anyone get close enough to harm her again, battling against a desperate, bone-deep weariness. Slowly, hesitantly, as if placing it on a hot stove, she laid her bleeding hand in his. He worked carefully, his touch methodical and impersonal. He cleaned the wound, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle as he washed away the dirt and blood. He applied a bit of salve and then wrapped the wound tightly with the clean linen. Through it all, she sat perfectly still, her breathing shallow, her gaze fixed on their joined hands. He was touching her, and it was not a prelude to pain. It was a remedy for it. When he was finished, he let her go, and she quickly pulled her hand back into the safety of her lap. But she did not leave. She just sat there, staring at the white bandage against her skin, a flag of truce in a long and bitter war. The arrival of a traveling trader a week later brought the outside world and all its poison crashing down on them. They had made a rare trip into town together, Lena walking a few paces behind Eli, a silent shadow at his heels. They were leaving the mercantile when a heavy wagon, laden with pelts and iron goods, rumbled to a stop. The man who climbed down was stout and bearded, his eyes small and shrewd. He took one look at Lena and his face twisted into a mask of ugly recognition. "Well, I'll be," he boomed, his voice dripping with venom. "If it ain't Arthur's little bride. Heard you ran out on him. Or did you do more than just run?" Lena froze, all the color draining from her face. She looked like a deer caught in a hunter's sights, her body rigid with a terror so profound it was almost paralyzing. The trader took a step closer, his lip curling in a sneer. He looked her up and down, then spat a thick glob of tobacco juice on the ground at her feet. "Murderer," he hissed, the word a gunshot in the quiet street. Eli did not hesitate. He did not shout a warning or offer a threat. He moved with a speed that was both shocking and absolute. He took one long stride, and his fist connected with the trader's jaw with a sickening crack of bone on bone. The big man staggered backward, his eyes wide with surprise, and collapsed in a heap in the dusty street. The townspeople who had been watching from the boardwalk stared, their mouths agape. In the stunned silence that followed, Eli turned back to Lena, but she was gone. She had vanished like a ghost, fleeing the scene, fleeing the word, fleeing the past that had just reached out and tried to reclaim her. He knew where to find her. There was an old, abandoned railroad bridge a mile out of town, a skeleton of timber and rust spanning a dry creek bed. It was a place of endings, a monument to a dream that had died. He found her there, huddled in the deep shadows beneath the trestle, her arms wrapped around her knees, shaking uncontrollably. He did not speak. He simply sat on the cold ground a few feet away, a silent sentinel, offering nothing but his presence. He waited. For a long time, the only sound was the mournful cry of the wind through the timbers above them and the ragged, broken rhythm of her breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice was a dead, hollow whisper, the sound of a soul that had been scoured clean of all hope. "His name was Arthur," she began, her eyes fixed on the gray, lifeless stone of the creek bed. "He was not a good man." She told him everything, not the details of the physical abuse, but the deeper, more profound violations of her spirit. She spoke of being treated like an animal, of being used in the night until she learned to leave her own body, of the slow, grinding erosion of her soul until there was almost nothing left. Her words were simple, stark, and utterly devastating. One night, he was full of whiskey. He was choking. On his own rage, I think, or maybe on his own bile. Her body began to tremble more violently. He was dying, right there, beside me in the bed. He looked at me, and I did nothing. She finally lifted her head, and her eyes, swimming in unshed tears, met his. I just watched. I could have helped him. I could have saved him. But I didn't. The confession hung in the cold air between them. A terrible, heavy thing. She expected him to recoil, to look at her with the same disgust as the traitor, as the entire town. She expected judgment, condemnation, horror. Eli just looked at her, his expression unchanged. He had seen men die in pointless, brutal ways. He had seen the darkness that lived in the human heart. Her story did not shock him. It saddened him. He saw not a murderer, but a survivor. He reached across the small space between them and, for the first time, he touched her face, his calloused thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Then you saved yourself," he said, his voice quiet but unshakable. "That ain't a sin." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. In all her months of running, of hiding, of drowning in guilt, no one had ever offered her anything but suspicion. He was offering her understanding. He was offering her grace, the dam of her control, so carefully constructed over years of pain, finally broke. A raw, ragged sob tore itself from her throat, and she wept, not in silence, but with the loud, agonized cries of a soul finally letting go of a burden it had carried for too long. Word of Eli's assault on the traitor spread through Dry Willow like a prairie fire. He had drawn a line in the sand, publicly and violently. The town responded. A few days later, he found 2 of his 3 cattle dead by the water trough, their bodies bloated, mouths flecked with foam. Poison. There was no proof, but he knew. It was a message. The final message came a week later, in the dead of night. He was woken by the frantic barking of the dog Lena had rescued, the one she had left in his care. He threw open his cabin door and saw it. The sky to the west was a terrifying, pulsing orange. His barn, the one he had spent months repairing, the one that held his tools, his wagon, and the winter hay, was engulfed in flames. He ran, but it was too late. The fire was a ravenous beast, consuming the dry timbers with a hungry roar. He managed to get his horse, Bess, out just before the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and embers. But everything else was lost. He stood there, his face illuminated by the destructive glow, the heat washing over him, and felt not despair, but a cold, clarifying rage. They thought this would break him. They thought this would make him run again. He was done running. Lena came to him then, emerging from the darkness, her face a pale mask of horror, streaked with tears and soot. "This is my fault," she choked out, her voice thick with guilt. "All of this, the cattle, the barn, it's because of me. I bring this on you." She grabbed the front of his shirt, her grip surprisingly strong. "You have to let me leave. Please, Eli, I'm not worth this. I am not worth what you will lose." He looked down at her, at this broken, terrified woman who thought she was a curse. He looked at the smoking ruin of his barn, at the land that had taken so much from him, and he knew, with a certainty that settled in the very marrow of his bones, that she was wrong. He placed his hands over hers, stilling their frantic trembling. "You're the only thing worth staying for." That night, the bitter cold was a physical presence, a constant, pressing enemy. She came to his cabin, a wraith in the moonlight, unable to stay in her own small, cold home, drawn to the single point of warmth in her desolate world. He let her in without a word. She stood by the hearth, shivering, though not from the cold, and then she finally broke. The last of her defenses crumbled into dust. She sank to her knees, her body racked with sobs, a storm of grief and guilt and a loneliness so profound it had nearly extinguished her. He knelt in front of her and simply held her. He did not offer platitudes or empty comforts. He just held her, absorbing the tremors that ran through her body, a solid living anchor in the storm of her sorrow. Through her weeping, she confessed the last, most painful truth. "I cannot remember," she whispered, her voice broken. "I cannot remember the last time someone touched me with kindness." He pulled back just enough to look at her face, shadowed and luminous in the firelight. He lifted her chin with his fingers, forcing her to meet his gaze. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was tender, hesitant, a question asked in the universal language of loneliness. Her lips were cold at first, then softened under his. She trembled the entire time, a leaf in a high wind, her entire being overwhelmed by this simple, gentle act. It was an offering, a promise, a healing. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the simple cot in the corner of the room. The shadows thrown by the firelight danced on the rough-hewn walls, wrapping them in an intimate, flickering gloom. He laid her down and followed, their bodies fitting together in the narrow space. Their love-making was like the kiss, slow, unsure, and profoundly real. It was a quiet exploration, a rediscovery of the body not as a source of pain or shame, but as a vessel for a connection that was deeper than skin. It was two broken people finding the pieces of themselves in the other's embrace. When it was over, she lay in his arms, her head tucked beneath his chin, and she began to weep again. But this was different. These were not the ragged sobs of grief, but the quiet, steady tears of release. It was the sound of a long frozen river finally breaking free, of a cage door swinging open, of a soul that had been lost in the wilderness for a very long time finally coming home. The fire that had consumed Eli's barn did not die out. It smoldered in the hearts of the people of Dry Willow, a low, smoky fire of fear and resentment that choked the very air. In the evenings, men gathered in the saloon, their voices low and angry. In the daylight, women whispered over their fences, their glances toward the Reeves homestead sharp as shards of glass. The town council, a body of ranchers and merchants who governed by consensus and tradition, met not in the town hall, but in the back room of the mercantile, the air thick with the smell of kerosene and suspicion. Reverend Wallace, his face etched with a weary piety, was the first to give their anger a holy name. "We are a community of the faithful," he said, his voice resonating in the small, cramped space. "We are a flock, and there is a wolf living at our edge. This woman, Lena Morrell, is a vessel of discord. And Elijah Reeves, he has chosen to harbor her. He has turned his back on this community, on this church, to protect a fugitive from God's law and man's. Michael Peterson, whose son Eli had disciplined, slammed his hand on a pickle barrel. It is more than that. Reverend, his defiance invites chaos. First my boy, then the cattle, then his own barn. It is a darkness spreading from that shack of hers, and now it has infected him. He is a danger to us all." The words went around the room, each man adding a layer to the condemnation. Harboring, it was the word they settled on, the word that turned Eli from a grieving son into a willing accomplice. He was sheltering a contagion, and for the health of the flock, the infected sheep must be cast out. "I urge you to consider excommunication," the Reverend said, his voice dropping to a solemn, grave tone. "We must formally sever him from the body of this church. We must show that we will not tolerate this blight in our midst. We must pray for his soul, but we must protect our own." A grim consensus settled over the men. They were drawing a line, not in the dust, but in the book of God. The town's fear, festering in the dark, needed only a spark to erupt into a blaze. The spark came 3 days later, in the form of a missing child, little Sarah Peterson, a girl of 5 with hair the color of corn silk, vanished in the late afternoon. She had been playing in her yard, and then she was simply gone. Her mother's frantic cries for her name soon became a town-wide panic. People fanned out, searching barns, sheds, and the thickets down by the river, as dusk began to bleed across the sky, turning the snow-covered fields a bruised purple. The whispers began. They started as a question, a fearful murmur. "Where is that woman? Has anyone seen the Morel woman?" The question quickly curdled into an accusation. She was a witch, wasn't she? A stealer of children. The trader had called her a murderer. What was to stop her from adding a child to her list of sins? The fear was a living thing now, a pack animal, and it needed something to hunt. Michael Peterson, his face a mask of pale, sweating terror for his lost daughter, became its voice. "She has her!" he roared, his voice breaking with grief and rage. "That witch has my Sarah. She has taken her for some dark purpose." That was all it took. The fear found its focus. The mob formed without any formal declaration. It was a gathering of shared terror and righteous fury. Men grabbed lanterns and pitchforks. Some took down the hunting rifles from their mantles. They were no longer neighbors. They were a righteous army, marching to save an innocent from a devil. Their boots crunched on the snow, their lanterns cutting swinging. Frantic paths through the growing darkness, all of them moving as one toward the two small cabins on the edge of town. Eli heard them coming. He was in his cabin, watching Lena stare into the fire. Her silence a heavy blanket of guilt she had worn since the night his barn burned. The distant sound of shouting, the bobbing of lights in the distance. It was a familiar sound to a man who had seen the worst of what people could do to one another. He stood up and took his rifle from the pegs above the door. "Stay inside," he said to Lena, his voice calm, but with an edge of cold steel. "Bar the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." Her eyes, wide with a new, fresh terror, flew to his. "What is it?" "It's the town," he said simply. He stepped outside into the freezing night and waited on his porch, the rifle held loosely but ready in his hands. The mob spilled onto his property, their lanterns making them look like a host of vengeful demons in the dark. They were a roiling mass of shadows and angry, shouting faces. Michael Peterson was at the front, his face contorted with a father's worst fear. "Reeves!" he bellowed. "Give us the woman. We know she has my daughter. Give her to us, or we will burn this place to the ground with both of you in it." Eli did not raise his voice. He let their shouts wash over him. He stood as still as a winter tree, the rifle a dark line against the faint light from his windows. "You are not setting foot on this land," he said, his voice carrying with an unnatural clarity over their noise. "Sarah is not here. You are chasing shadows." "Liar!" someone screamed from the crowd. "You're protecting a child stealer, a murderer." "Go home, Peterson," Eli said, his gaze locked on the frantic man. "You are terrifying your wife and wasting time. Your daughter is lost, not taken. Go look for her." "We will search the cabin," Peterson yelled, taking a step forward. Eli raised the rifle, the click of the hammer being cocked a small, sharp sound that cut through the clamor. The front ranks of the mob hesitated, their righteous fury faltering in the face of cold, ready violence. "The first man who takes another step is the first man who dies," Eli said. There was no anger in his voice. There was only a promise, as cold and hard as the frozen ground beneath their feet. The standoff stretched for a long, terrible moment. The mob shuffled, their collective courage wavering. They were ranchers and shopkeepers, not killers, and the man standing before them was not a frightened victim. He was a bulwark, a wall of deadly intent. It was a shout from the back of the crowd that broke the spell. "We found her! She's here!" A man came running, waving his lantern. "She is found! She is safe! She was asleep in the hay cart behind the saloon! She is unharmed!" A collective sigh of relief went through the crowd. Michael Peterson seemed to sag, the rage draining out of him, leaving only a hollow, trembling exhaustion. The tension broke. The mob began to dissolve, their pitchforks and rifles suddenly looking foolish and out of place. They turned their backs, their purpose gone, and began to trudge back toward town, their voices now a low, embarrassed mumble. Not a single person looked back. Not a single person offered a word of apology. Eli remained on the porch until the last light had vanished. He uncocked the rifle and went back inside. Lena was huddled in the farthest corner of the room, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking. "It is over," he said softly. "She is safe." Lena looked up, her face a wasteland of self-loathing. "They will never stop," she whispered, her voice raw. "As long as I am here, they will see a monster. I make you a monster too. I bring nothing but ruin." In the days that followed, she retreated so far into herself that she was almost gone. She returned to her own cabin and did not emerge. The food he left on her porch went untouched. The smoke from her chimney was thin and sporadic. She was starving herself, physically and spiritually, punishing herself for the chaos she believed she had caused. Eli could not stand it. One evening, he went to her door and did not knock. He simply opened it and walked in. She was sitting on the floor, wrapped in a thin blanket, staring at the cold, dead ashes in her hearth. She looked like a ghost. "This has to stop. Lena," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "You cannot live like this. This is all I deserve," she whispered, not looking at him. He knelt in front of her. "No, it is not. I want you to come live with me. In my cabin. Your place is with me." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, a truth he had come to understand in the long, quiet hours. She finally looked at him, her eyes dull with despair. "So I can watch them destroy what is left of you. So I can be the reason they cast you out completely. I will not do that to you. Eli, I will not be your ruin." He could not argue with her logic, because it was born of a desire to protect him. He left her there, the space between them filled with her noble, heartbreaking refusal. 3 days later, a storm rolled in. A wet, miserable squall of sleet and freezing rain. The world outside was a gray misery. He was mending a piece of tack by the fire when his door was pushed open. Lena stood on the threshold, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face, her clothes dripping a puddle onto the floor. She held a small bundle in her arms, her few worldly possessions wrapped in an oilcloth. She did not look beaten or desperate. She looked resolute. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw not a surrender, but a decision. She had chosen him over her fear. Without a word, he took her bundle and set it down. He took the wet shawl from her shoulders and sat her by the fire. He gave her a dry blanket and a cup of hot coffee, and then he left her alone to get warm. An hour later, the smell of cooking filled the small cabin. He turned from the window to see her at the hearth, stirring a pot of stew he had started earlier. She moved about the small space as if she belonged there, her earlier hesitation gone, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. He sat at the table and watched her. She added a bit of dried thyme from his shelf, tasted the broth, and added a pinch of salt. She ladled the stew into 2 bowls and brought them to the table. She sat opposite him, and they ate in a comfortable silence. The only sounds, the clink of their spoons against the bowls and the howl of the storm outside. He looked at her, at the firelight catching the strands of her dark hair, at the way her presence filled the empty spaces in the cabin. In his life, he was overwhelmed by how natural it felt, how right. It was as if a piece of him he hadn't even known was missing had just come home. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of Sheriff Brody the next morning. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world encased in a thin, glittering layer of ice. The sheriff's face was grim. "Eli," he said, his breath pluming in the cold air. "I have some bad news. That traitor you had a run-in with, he didn't just nurse a sore jaw. He rode on to the next county and filed a formal report. He told them who Lena was, or who he thinks she is. The law in Clay County, Nebraska, has officially issued a warrant. She is now considered a dangerous fugitive, wanted for questioning in the death of her husband. Arthur Miller." Eli felt the ground shift beneath his feet. It was one thing to fight a town's prejudice. It was another thing entirely to fight the law. "They will send a marshal," Brody continued, his voice low. "It might take a week. It might take a month, but he will come. And he will have a piece of paper that gives him the right to take her, by force if necessary. And anyone who stands in his way will be charged with obstruction. That means you." He looked at Eli with something like pity in his eyes. "I am telling you this because your father was a good man. Do not throw your life away for her, son." When Eli went back inside, Lena already knew. She had heard it all through the thin cabin walls. Her face was ashen. The hunted look was back in her eyes. "I will not be the reason they put you in a cage," she said, her voice trembling. But Eli was already thinking, his mind racing past the fear to a solution. "No one is going to a cage." He looked out the window, toward the high, rugged hills that rose up behind his property, their peaks shrouded in mist. "My father built a small cabin up there. For hunting trips. It is hidden, hard to find if you do not know the way. We can get supplies. We can go there. We will wait this out." They left that night, under the cover of a moonless sky. He packed 2 mules with everything they would need: flour, beans, salt, ammunition, blankets. Lena moved beside him, a silent, efficient partner, her fear channeled into a focused energy. They traveled for hours, climbing higher and higher into the hills, the air growing thinner and colder. The trail was little more than a game path, treacherous and icy. Just before dawn, they arrived. The cabin was little more than a one-room shelter, built solidly of stone and timber, nestled in a stand of old-growth pines. It was a place outside of time, a sanctuary from the world below. Inside, it was cold and dusty, but it was safe. They built a fire, and its warmth slowly pushed back the bone-deep chill. There, surrounded by nothing but the immense, indifferent silence of the mountains, they finally found peace. The town, the warrant, the angry mob. It all felt a world away. There was only the wind in the pines, the crackle of the fire, and each other. In the days that followed, the silence and the safety uncoiled something deep within them. The last of their secrets fell away. One night, as they sat before the fire, he told her about his brother, Thomas. He spoke of the guilt he carried, a weight he had never shared with another soul. "He wanted me to enlist with him," Eli said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the flames. "I was older. I should have been there to watch his back, but I said no. I told him it was not our fight. He went alone." He pulled up his sleeve, revealing a long, jagged scar on his forearm from a branding iron accident years ago. "The day I got this, he was writing a letter home, telling us he was fine. By the time the letter arrived, he was already dead. I feel sometimes like I ran away, not from the war, but from my own family, from the grief. I ran, and I did not stop running until I came back here." Lena listened, her expression full of a deep, quiet empathy. When he was finished, she did not speak. She reached out and traced the line of the scar on his arm with her fingertip. Then she leaned forward and gently kissed the scarred skin. It was an absolution, an acceptance of the flawed, wounded man he was, just as he had accepted her. That night, their lovemaking was different. It was not the slow, hesitant healing of before. It was fiercer, deeper, a raw and desperate claiming. It was the passion of 2 people who had found their only anchor in a storm-tossed world. They came together not to mend what was broken, but to forge something new in the fire of their shared exile. It was no longer about healing. It was about belonging. The peace they found in the high mountain cabin was as fragile as the first green shoots of spring pushing through the melting snow. The thaw had come. A slow, dripping surrender of winter to a sun that was gaining strength each day. Water trickled from the eaves of the cabin, ran in small rivulets down the game trails, and swelled the creek in the ravine below into a rushing, noisy thing. For weeks, this thaw had been a promise, a sign that the harshest part of their exile was over. But as the passes cleared and the world below became accessible once more, the promise began to feel like a threat. The same melt that freed the land would free the law to travel. They had fallen into a rhythm of survival that felt more like living than anything either of them had known for years. He hunted. She tended the cabin. They repaired the roof, gathered firewood, and spoke in the easy, unburdened way of 2 people who had no one else to speak to. The silence between them was no longer a chasm, but a comfortable space, filled with a deep and abiding understanding. He would watch her hands as she kneaded dough for bread, hands that were no longer bruised but still bore the faint scars of her past, and he would feel a fierce, protective tenderness that was an ache in his chest. She would watch him as he cleaned his rifle by the fire, his profile hard and uncompromising in the flickering light, and see not a drifter or an outcast, but a rock, the only solid ground she had ever known. The end of their sanctuary came on a morning when the air smelled of damp pine and warming earth. It was the sound that alerted him first, not the familiar sounds of the wilderness, but the unnatural clink of horseshoes on stone, the jingle of harness. He was splitting wood outside the cabin and he froze, his axe held mid-swing. Lena appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her hand flying to her throat. They did not need to speak. They both knew. He told her to go inside and stay away from the window. He took up his rifle, not with panic, but with a grim, weary resignation. He walked to the edge of the clearing and waited. There were 4 of them, their horses picking their way carefully up the last of the treacherous trail. Sheriff Brody was in the lead, his face drawn and unhappy. Beside him rode a taller man with a hard, square jaw and cold, emotionless eyes. He wore a badge that marked him as a United States Marshal. 2 younger, eager-looking deputies brought up the rear. "Eli," Sheriff Brody called out, reining in his horse. "There is no need for that rifle. We have come to do a job, that is all." The marshal, whose name was Vance, dismounted. He moved with a stiff, self-important authority. "Elijah Reeves," he said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. "I have a warrant for the arrest of one Lena Morrell, also known as Lena Miller. She is wanted for questioning in the death of her husband, Arthur Miller, in Clay County, Nebraska. We have reason to believe you are harboring a fugitive. Step aside." Eli did not move. His knuckles were white on the stock of the rifle. "She is not going anywhere with you. Son, do not be a fool," the marshal said, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "You are interfering with federal law. That is a crime that will see you rot in a federal prison. I will ask you one more time. Step aside and give us the woman." "You will have to kill me first," Eli said, and the quiet certainty in his voice made one of the young deputies shift nervously in his saddle. Sheriff Brody swung down from his horse and walked forward, his hands held up in a gesture of peace. "Eli, listen to me. Nobody needs to die here today. You cannot win this fight." He lowered his voice, stepping closer so only Eli could hear. "Marshal Vance here is not a patient man. He will see this through, but I can make you a deal. If she comes out, if she surrenders peacefully, I will give you my word. There will be no charges filed against you for obstruction. You will walk away a free man. But if you make a stand, he will charge you, and I will not be able to stop him. He will see you both in chains." Eli's gaze did not waver from the marshal. "I am not making a deal for my freedom that costs hers." "It is not your choice to make," Brody hissed, his frustration boiling over. "It is hers. You are taking that choice away from her by standing here with that rifle, ready to get yourself killed. What good will you be to her then? A dead man cannot protect anyone." The words struck home, a painful, undeniable truth. From inside the cabin, Lena had heard it all. She had pressed her ear to the rough-hewn logs, her heart hammering against her ribs. She heard the marshal's cold pronouncement, Eli's quiet defiance, and Sheriff Brody's desperate, practical bargain. A free man. They would let him be a free man. If only she would surrender. The choice was a clean, sharp blade. His life or hers. There was no longer any room for them both. That night, a tense, unspoken truce held. The lawmen made their camp 100 yards down the trail, the glow of their campfire a malevolent orange eye in the darkness. Eli sat in the cabin, the rifle across his lap, his body wired with a tension that would not let him rest. Lena made them a simple supper of beans and biscuits, her movements unnaturally calm and deliberate. She insisted he eat. She insisted he get some sleep. "I will keep watch," she said, her voice a soft, steady whisper. You have stood guard for me long enough. Let me watch over you, just for this one night." He was exhausted, the long day of confrontation having drained him more than a week of hard labor. He finally relented, lying down on the cot, his hand never leaving the rifle by his side. He drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. The last image in his mind, the sight of her sitting in the chair by the dying fire, her silhouette a study in quiet resolve. He woke with a start, a sudden, piercing sense of wrongness. The cabin was cold, the fire was dead ash, and Lena was gone. For a moment, he simply stared at the empty chair, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. Then he saw it, a folded piece of paper on the small table beside his cot. His heart seized. He snatched it up. Her handwriting was neat and clear, the letters formed with a painful precision. "My dearest Eli," it began, "I have only ever brought you ruin, a poisoned well, a burned barn, a town full of hate, now a prison cell. I will not be the reason they cage you, too. You gave me a home when I had none. You showed me kindness when I had forgotten what it felt like. You saw me when no one else would. That is more than I ever thought I would have in this life. It is enough. Do not come after me. Please, live your life. Rebuild what I have cost you. Let me go. Yours, Lena." A raw, animal sound of denial was ripped from his throat. He threw on his boots and coat, his movements frantic, clumsy with a desperation that bordered on madness. He burst from the cabin into the pre-dawn gloom. The lawman's camp was stirring. He saw her then, a small, solitary figure walking down the trail toward them, her hands held out in front of her in a gesture of surrender. He did not think. He did not plan. He ran to the makeshift corral where he kept Bess, threw the saddle on her back with shaking hands, and mounted. He rode down the trail like a madman, the horse's hooves slipping on the icy patches, heedless of the danger. He had to get to her. He had to stop her. He caught up to them on a wider stretch of the road, where the hills began to level out into the plains. The marshal had Lena by the arm, ready to lift her onto the back of a spare horse. She was not crying. Her face was a pale, emotionless mask, her eyes fixed on some distant point, as if her soul had already departed her body. "Let her go!" Eli's voice was a ragged roar. He slid Bess to a halt, positioning himself between the lawmen and the road back to town, cutting off their path. Marshal Vance's eyes narrowed. He drew his pistol. "I warned you, Reeves. You have made your choice." His deputies followed his lead, their own guns clearing their holsters. Eli ignored them. His eyes were only for Lena. "I am not letting you do this," he said, his voice thick with a desperate plea. "You must," she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. "It is the only way. There is no way without you," he answered. In a single, fluid motion, he drew his own pistol and leveled it at the closest deputy. "I said, let her go." The world stopped. The air was thin and sharp, the silence broken only by the nervous snorting of the horses. It was a standoff, a perfect, deadly triangle of intent. "Eli, no!" Lena screamed, the sound tearing through the frozen tableau. "Do not kill anyone for me! Please, do not do this!" She struggled against the marshal's grip, trying to put herself between Eli and the deputies. It was into this tableau of desperation that a new sound intruded, the sound of another horse, coming hard from the direction of town. They all turned. A lone figure was riding toward them. A woman, her face set and determined. As she drew closer, Lena gasped. The woman was plain, her face weathered by work and worry, but her eyes were clear and direct. She reined in her horse and looked directly at Marshal Vance. "My name is Martha Gable," she said, her voice steady and strong. "I am Silas Gable's sister. I used to live in Clay County, Nebraska. I lived on the homestead next to Arthur Miller." She looked at Lena, her expression softening with a deep, sorrowful pity. "I heard what that traitor was saying. I heard the law was called. I could not stay silent any longer." She turned her gaze back to the marshal, and her voice hardened with an old anger. Arthur Miller was a monster. He was a cruel man, not just to his wife, but to everyone. He beat his animals. He cheated his neighbors. And what he did to that girl, she gestured to Lena, was a sin before God and man. I heard her screams at night. We all did. We were just too afraid of him to interfere. He bragged, when he was drunk, about the things he did to her. The night he died, he had come home in a rage. I saw him. He was like a wild animal. Whatever happened in that house that night, that girl did not act out of malice. She acted to save her own life. It was not murder, it was survival. The marshal stared at her, his face a thundercloud of thwarted authority. That is your story. It proves nothing. It is the truth, Martha Gable said simply. And I will ride all the way to Clay County, and I will swear to it on a Bible in a court of law. And I will find others who will do the same. You have a warrant based on the words of a drunken trader and the gossip of a dead man's family. I'm giving you the testimony of an eyewitness to his cruelty. You can drag her back there in chains, but you will lose. All you will do is put her through more pain. Marshal Vance looked from Martha to Lena's bruised and haunted face, then to Eli, whose pistol had not wavered. He was a man of the law, but he was also a practical man. A difficult arrest, a potential gunfight, and now a credible witness who would dismantle his case. He slowly, grudgingly, lowered his pistol. This is not over, he grumbled, but the threat was empty. He released Lena's arm. Without another word, he mounted his horse, and he and his deputies rode away, their faces sour with the taste of defeat. Eli and Lena returned to the homestead, the silence of the ride back heavy with all that had happened. They were free, but they were not welcome. The town had seen the lawmen leave without their prisoner. They had heard Martha Gable's story, a story that absolved Lena of murder but confirmed her as a victim of a brutal, unspeakable past, a past they did not want in their town. They could no longer deny her truth, but they would never forgive her for making them confront it. The shunning was colder now, more complete. The first sign was the well, their new well. When Eli lowered the bucket, it came up smelling of rotten chemicals. Someone had poisoned it again, a petty, cowardly act of malice. The next Sunday, when they walked to the church, they found the door barred to them. Reverend Wallace met them on the steps, his face a mask of sorrowful duty. "This is no longer a place for you, Elijah," he said quietly. "The congregation is unsettled. Your path is not our path." They turned and walked away, the heavy oak door closing behind them, shutting them out not only from the house of God, but from the last vestige of community. Still, they did not bow. They cleaned out the well. They drew their water from the river. They turned their backs on the town that had turned its back on them. They had each other, and for now, that would have to be enough. A few days later, Eli was setting new fence posts to replace the ones damaged in the fire. Lena was with him, helping him stretch the new wire. He had finished setting a thick, sturdy corner post at the edge of the property, the one closest to the road. He took out his knife and, with slow, deliberate strokes, began to carve into the wood. Lena watched as he first carved his own name, deep into the grain. Reeves. Then, just below it, he carefully carved another. Lena. He stood back, looking at the two names, bound together on the wood. A silent declaration to any who passed. He turned to her. The afternoon sun was low, casting a golden light across the fields. He took her hand, the one he had bandaged, and held it in his own. "Marry me, Lena," he said, his voice quiet and serious. She looked at him, her eyes wide, 1,000 questions in them. He answered them before she could ask. Not for the town, not for God, not for a piece of paper in the courthouse. For us, let us be a family. Let us be a beginning, right here on this land. He looked from her face to the names on the post, then back to her. "Let me give you my name. It is all I have left to give." Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time, they were not tears of sorrow or grief or release. They were tears of quiet, profound, and overwhelming joy. She did not need to speak the word. Her answer was in the way she tightened her grip on his hand, in the small, trembling smile that finally, truly, reached her eyes. They did not marry in a church. before a preacher who had barred his door to them, nor in a courthouse, before a law that had sought to put her in chains. They married on the wildflower ridge that overlooked their homestead, on an afternoon in late spring when the world was awash in the vibrant, defiant colors of Indian paintbrush and lupine. Their only witnesses were the vast, silent sky above and the wind that whispered through the tall prairie grasses. A witness that had seen the land's creation and would see its end. A witness that did not judge. Eli wore a clean shirt, his hands scrubbed but still bearing the permanent testament of his labor in the lines and calluses. Lena wore a simple blue dress, one she had painstakingly mended and washed until it was soft and pale. She had woven a few of the wildflowers into her dark hair. There was no music but the song of a meadowlark, no sermon but the words they had chosen for themselves. He took her hands in his. They were strong, capable hands that had dug a well beside him, mended his fences, and held him in the night. "I have been a lone man for most of my life," he began, his voice low and steady, a sound meant only for her and the wind. "I thought that was my lot, to walk alone. Then I saw you, and I recognized something I thought I had lost forever, a reason to stand my ground, a reason to build instead of just wander. With you, Lena, I am home." He placed a simple, thin band of worked iron on her finger, a ring he had fashioned himself in the forge he was rebuilding. "I give you my name, I give you my heart, I give you my life." Tears welled in Lena's eyes, but they did not fall. They were jewels of a joy she was still learning to hold. "I was a ghost," she whispered, her voice fragile but clear. "A shadow, running from a past that had already killed me once. I did not believe in kindness. I did not believe in safety. You gave me both. You stood in front of me and fought a world of darkness, and you never once flinched. You taught me how to breathe again. Eli, you taught me how to live." She had no ring for him, nothing to give but the promise itself. "I take your name, and I give you all that I am, and all that I will ever be." They sealed their vows not with a pronouncement from an outside authority, but with a quiet kiss, a tender affirmation of a truth that already existed between them. They were husband and wife. They belonged to each other. And as they stood on that ridge, looking down at the small cabin and the freshly plowed fields, they were a kingdom of two, under a sky that was finally their own. The wall of the town's scorn did not crumble overnight, but cracks began to appear. When they rode into Dry Willow for supplies, the silence that greeted them was different. It was no longer the sharp, hostile silence of condemnation, but a heavy, uncomfortable silence of shame. The townsfolk still looked away, but their glances were no longer hard. Some eyes, as they slid past Lena, lingered for a moment, and in them she saw the faint, flickering ghost of guilt. Martha Gable's testimony had been a stone thrown into a stagnant pond, and the ripples were still spreading. Lena was no longer a simple monster, a convenient vessel for their fears. She was a woman, a victim of a cruelty they could barely imagine, and they had sought to crucify her for it. The knowledge sat ill within them, a bitter meal they were all forced to digest. They did not apologize, but their certainty had been broken, and in its place, a grudging, awkward respect began to grow. The first true thaw came during a ferocious spring storm that turned the world into a churning chaos of wind, rain, and mud. A bolt of lightning, terrifyingly close, struck a cottonwood tree near their pasture, spooking the cattle. One of the cows, heavy with calf and panicked by the thunder, bolted and fell, breaking her leg in the thick, sucking mud of a runoff ditch. Eli found her there, bellowing in pain and terror, her labor already beginning. It was a hopeless situation. He was one man against the storm, the mud, and the dead weight of a 1,000-pound animal. He was preparing himself for the grim task of putting her out of her misery when Lena appeared at his side, her face set, her eyes clear. "We can save the calf," she said, her voice a shout over the wind. For the next hour, they fought. They worked in the driving rain, covered in mud and blood. A desperate, two-person army against death. Lena, her small frame surprisingly strong, her hands gentle but firm, knew what to do. She was not afraid of the mess, of the pain, of the primal struggle of birth. It was a life coming into the world, and she would stand as its champion. They were so consumed by their task that they did not notice the rider who had approached until he was dismounting beside them. It was Michael Peterson. He had been riding his own fence line, checking for storm damage. When he saw their struggle, the man who had led a mob to their door, who had called Lena a witch, now stood in the pouring rain, his face a mixture of awe and uncertainty. He did not speak. He seemed to understand that words were useless here. He simply waded into the mud, his own considerable strength joining theirs. Together, the three of them worked, and as the storm raged around them, they pulled a new life, slick and steaming. From the dying mother, the calf, a perfect little heifer, lay trembling in the mud. Lena cleared its mouth and nose, rubbing it vigorously with a burlap sack until it let out a shaky bleat. Peterson watched her, his expression unreadable. A life had been lost, but another had been saved. In the raw, elemental drama of birth and death, their shared history of accusation and anger seemed a small and petty thing. "You have good hands," he said, his voice a low gruffle. It was not an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. A beginning. That small shift, born in mud and rain, grew slowly in the weeks that followed. The strict shunning they had endured began to ease when Eli went to the mercantile. Silas Gable no longer looked through him, but met his eye and asked about the winter barley. They began to trade again, the flow of commerce a grudging but necessary bridge. Then the women started to come. First, it was Martha Gable's cousin, her child suffering from a croupy cough. She came to the back door of the cabin, her eyes downcast, and asked if it was true that Lena knew about herbs. Lena, surprised but gracious, gave her a small bundle of dried mullein and instructions on how to brew it into a tea. The woman left a small jar of honey on the step in return. A few weeks later, another woman came, asking about a salve for burns. Lena's past was not forgotten. The whispers had not vanished entirely, but slowly, her story began to grow new chapters. She was no longer just the woman with the dark past. She was the woman who knew how to birth a calf in a storm, the woman whose remedies could soothe a child's cough, the woman who met their averted glances with a quiet, unshakable dignity. She was becoming a person, complex and whole, in the eyes of the very people who had once tried to erase her. One quiet Sunday afternoon, Eli found her in the small, fenced-off graveyard behind the cabin. It held the graves of his parents and his brother, Thomas, their simple wooden crosses weathered by years of sun and snow. Lena was on her knees, not praying, but working. She had cleared all the weeds, her hands gentle as she tended the earth around each grave. She had planted small, hardy wildflowers at the base of his mother's cross. She was caring for his ghosts, embracing his past as her own. As he watched, she stood up and walked to the edge of the plot. She was holding a flat, smooth river stone, about the size of a loaf of bread. She knelt again and set it in the earth, separate from the family crosses, but clearly a part of the sacred ground. He walked closer. He saw that she had painstakingly etched words into the stone's surface. It did not bear a name or a date. It simply said, "For who I used to be." He stood beside her, understanding completely this was a funeral. A burial for the frightened, haunted woman who had fled into the night, for the ghost who had stood barefoot in the snow at the river's edge. She was laying her old self to rest, here, in the safety of this land, among the family she had chosen. He placed his hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into his touch, the two of them standing in silent tribute to the woman she had survived. Their first harvest of winter barley was a good one, more than enough for their own needs. With the small profit they made, they bought lumber. Not for a new barn. Not yet, but for something else. Together, day by day. They began to build a small, one-room structure on a piece of their land that bordered the main road. It had large windows to let in the light and a sturdy porch. When it was finished, Eli presented a letter to the town council. The letter stated that he and his wife, Lena Reeves, were donating the new building and the small plot of land it sat on to the town of Dry Willow for use as a proper schoolhouse. The current school was little more than a cramped, dark room at the back of the church. The town resisted at first. Pride and old prejudice made them reluctant to accept such a gift from the town's outcasts. But their need was greater than their pride. Their children deserved better. After a week of contentious debate, the council sent a short, formal letter of acceptance the day the school opened. Lena and Eli watched from their porch. They saw the children, including young Sarah Peterson, running and laughing, their voices bright on the clear morning air. They ran past Lena, and this time, they did not chant cruel names or throw stones. Some of the older ones, who remembered her saving the little boy from the bolting horses, even offered a shy, quick wave. They were not afraid of her anymore. She was just Mrs. Reeves, the woman who lived on the farm where the new school was. With the rebuilding of their lives came the rebuilding of their home. Eli began to construct a new barn, larger and sturdier than the first. He worked on it in the evenings, after the farm work was done. One night, while searching for some old tools in a trunk he had salvaged from the fire, his hand brushed against a stack of papers hidden beneath a moth-eaten blanket. He pulled them out. It was Lena's handwriting, page after page of it. It was not a journal, but stories, fables of clever coyotes and lonely mountains, tales of women who found their strength not in swords or kingdoms, but in the quiet resilience of the prairie itself. He had known she was strong, known she was kind, known she was brave. He had not known she was a creator of worlds. He had never been told that before the world had tried to silence her. She had been a writer. He carefully placed the pages back in the trunk, a feeling of profound tenderness washing over him. It was another secret part of her, a beautiful, hidden garden of her soul that was finally, in the safety of this new life, beginning to bloom again. They sat together on the porch that evening, watching the last of the sun's fire bleed out across the vast Wyoming sky. The air was cool and smelled of new-cut hay and distant rain. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting in his, the simple iron ring a comfortable, permanent weight on her finger. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that exists only between two people who know each other's souls completely. "I did not think I would ever feel warm again," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper against the immensity of the landscape. He looked out at the horizon, at the land that had tested them, had nearly broken them, and had ultimately saved them both. He tightened his grip on her hand. "You were never cold." "Lena," he replied, his voice full of a deep, unwavering certainty. "They just did not see the fire in you." The wind, their oldest witness, picked up, rustling the leaves of the cottonwood trees and carrying the sweet scent of the distant wildflowers. It blew across the fields, across the new schoolhouse, across the quiet graves on the hill. It was a wind of change, a wind of healing. It carried off the final, ghostly pages of her old life, scattering them like dust until they were nothing. What was left was only them, her hand in his, solid and real, and the land they had tamed, together. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from to connect with each other. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and share your thoughts in English.